So we're going to begin a discussion of the nervous system rather quickly, divided into two different. So basic building block or unit of the nervous system is called the neuron. These are the cells of the nervous system. All of them have a body, kind of a central bubble or piece. It's got the nucleus and all the cytoplasmic organelles you'd expect. The key feature of the specialized cells here, the neurons, is they have the extensions from that main body. We call these fibers, long, thin extensions. The dendrites generally receive signals. They are shorter than the axons, which tend to send the signals and are longer. Often the axons are covered with a myelin sheath um, that insulates the electrical impulses that travel down, protects them from other axons and things like that. The myelin sheath is made of fat, and fat, it doesn't, because it's nonpolar, it's hydrophobic, it doesn't conduct electricity like proteins might or something like that. Here's some examples of neurons. Um, you've got the dendrites. This is kind of a classic example, the dendrites around the outside, and then the axon leaving. So nerve signals come from a number of different sources, number of different axons on other neurons, and then the cell decides, will I send a signal or not? That signal goes down the axon. So you can have the uh, main body of the neuron in the center, or it can be off to the side in some way, shape, or form, or in between, or some sort of terminal uh, neuron having some. So here's a more detailed look of a schematic of what we described already. So you've got signal direction. So signals are going to come into the dendrites, kind of the hair on top of the cell body and nucleus in there. The collection of all those inputs, and then the neuron will decide, am I going to fire or not? If it fires, it's going to send a signal down the axon. We have the myelin sheaths, are basically fat cells that kind of wrap around. You can see they go a spiral around. So um, long flat cells that one at a time cover the axon. This insulates the electrical signal. It also um, allows the signal to move faster because the signal seems to skip along um, around these myelin sheaths, which are called Schwann cells, are what wraps around that long. So there's the nucleus, Schwann cell, and it wraps around to form an insulation on that. So look, flow of the signal, all these inputs, uh, the cell has to decide, will I fire or will I not? It's a binary choice. If it fires, it sends a signal down here to the ends where they connect to another nerve or some sort of muscle. This shows a couple of connections here. Again, we've got the dendrites collecting a signal. If the signal goes on, we've got a split axon here, and it goes in two directions. If that signal comes down here, the following neutron neuron collects the signal and decides whether it wants to fire or not. So axon coming back out. We can also have receptors. So this is a receptor here, pressure receptor. As that gets squeezed, it's going to get triggered a signal that's going to go up, and you're going to send that signal to a nerve cell farther up the line. So the more you push, the more likely you're going to have some stimulation on the nerve end right here. If you do fire, you're going to get a very sharp up and down that allows that signal to communicate information to the body. When we think about the nervous system, we're dealing with two different parts. The central nervous system, which we'll abbreviate CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, which we'll abbreviate PNS. So if we look at the central nervous system first, we're talking pretty much about the brain and the spinal cord. You've got some different parts here that you're working with. So this is a drawing. It doesn't quite perfectly match up to the list there, but it's good enough for what we're doing. And you're focusing on kind of lower program base of the brain parts that control the things that we don't think much about. So data information, brainstem information comes in and out of the brain. You've got temperature controls, blood controls, coordination of body movement, control of breathing, circulation, swallowing, digestion, controls the breathing, integrates data, moves things on. So you've got the midbrain as you move up here. You have these other parts here, the pons and the midbrain are going to control the lower order functions, the things we don't think about. As we move up to the parts of the brain here, we get to the cortex or cerebellum. We've got memories that we think about, speech centers, learning centers, our ability to think, process, move through. So all these parts of the brain work together, and they're all the central nervous system is protected by bone. You've got the skull around the brain, you've got the spinal vertebrae around the spinal cord. So central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord all harvested or housed in what part of the skeleton? So you should be thinking axial skeleton, as we discussed before. Uh, this is responsible for integration, the central nervous system. It listens to all the inputs, which are called afferent, decides what to do, and then sends an answer in some way, shape, or form, and that's called an efferent signal, so some sort of response. So collects information. We can think about our senses. That information is collected. The brain decides what to do with that and then sends out a signal of what it wants the body to do, how it wants the body to move, where it wants to go, how it wants to behave. We look at the peripheral nervous system. We've got a number of different nerves. We're not going to ask you to remember those, but for those of you interested, here's all the nerves going through. So we've got a central nervous system, spinal cord, brain, maybe a fist and a half big in our full-grown cows. We got the spinal cord running down, and then everything coming off, everything outside the spinal cord, everything outside of the skull, at least the cranial part of the skull, um, not the facial features of the skull, is called the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is everything outside the skull and the vertebra. Um, it's our lines of communication between whatever parts of the body we have and the central nervous system. So we have the nerves, the long things that we see in that last photo, and we have the sensory. So it's the uh, parts of the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system that provides information, collects information. That's all called the afferent side. And then we have the motor or efferent side that sends out the commands. So peripheral nervous system collects information, it goes to the central nervous system, and then it comes back out. Um, Kind of a U if you think about it, moving through, and we'll show you a better graphic of that in just a minute. So when we're thinking about this peripheral nervous system, one of the things I want to do is work on a Venn diagram. So what is similar about central and peripheral nervous system, and then what are different? What's different about the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system? So give that some thought. Here's a diagram from Mr. Dr. Day. It's a pretty good diagram here of the organization of the nervous system, which is why I use it. So again, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. So you have the central nervous system. Input is going to be coming up the afferent side. We go up the to the central nervous system, then we come back down and we go out the efferent side. So note that this is kind of split here. You're not going around in circles, you're going up and over and out. So everything out here is the peripheral nervous system. So we have a sensory side, we have internal information that's recorded and sent to the brain, and then external information goes up the afferent side. The central nervous system sends a response. On the efferent side, we call these nerves motor nerves versus sensory. Motor, and you have voluntary, which is the skeletal muscle, the somatic um, part of the nervous system. And then you have the involuntary, the autonomic, so the things we don't think about, the beating of the heart, the digesting food, the breathing, kidney function, all those things are involuntary, autonomic. And then we divide the involuntary into two parts, parasympathetic and sympathetic. Each of those parts has a different role or different function that needs to be filled. So if we focus on the sensory or afferent side, the internal tells us, what am I doing? How's my body working? How does everything feel? How is everything working? External is what's going on outside my body. Is it cold? Is it raining? Is it a hard seat to sit on? Does it smell good? Is it bright light? All those things that are going around me are interpreted by the senses, and we um, feed that information to the brain in hopefully a way that will be useful. So, coming out of the central nervous system back into the peripheral nervous system, we have the motor or efferent. So, A comes before E, E is going out. We have the voluntary, sometimes called the somatic. It controls the skeletal muscle. So, this is the stuff we think about. So, the skeletal muscle moving around, waving high, washing our hands lately, stuff like that. We have the involuntary side or involuntary half, which is also called the autonomic. This generally controls smooth muscle and organs. And as we mentioned already, it's the stuff we don't generally think about, don't have to think about, but it still gets done. So we can look at that schematic going through. We have our sensory inputs. We're going up the afferent side, the sensory input goes into the central nervous system, spinal cord, brain. And then the brain decides what to do with that information. We send it out the afferent side, the motor side, the peripheral nervous system here. So sensory output, and we go back to a muscle in some way, shape, or form, and we move it in hopefully a way that will help us achieve our goal. So there's no direct connection here, but as we make changes here, the senses will pick them up, notice them, and then we kind of get that cycle going. But there's no direct connection between these two parts. So reflexes, they're automatic. They're going to enter the dorsal side of the spinal cord, the afferent side. So most of our nerves coming up into the central nervous are going to be on the dorsal side of the spinal column. those that are leaving. Motor nerves are going to be on the ventral side of the spinal column. Reflexes are about as short as pathway as you can get in the nervous system, and these things are generally hardwired. It's why we pull our hand back from a stove even before we realize we got our hand burnt. That's a reflex. Stretch reflexes and muscles. If a muscle gets stretched, its immediate response is to tighten up, and you see that demonstrated when they do the patella reflex. And they put the hammer just below your kneecap there. We're stretching a quadricep. A good reflex will say, okay, if we stretch that quadricep, the quadricep will want to contract, and therefore we get that little kick. With reflexes, we're talking about mostly nervous, a peripheral nervous system. We're only in the spinal cord for a very short time. The brain isn't the first thing that gets So here's a reflex arc, so simple reflex arc. So we have a stretch receptor in a muscle in some way, shape, or form. That sends a signal up here. We've got two nerves involved. We synapse with another nerve, and that's going to send out a motor input. So you can also have a little bit more complicated that here's the reflex getting done what needs to get done, and then here's the other half letting the brain know what happened. But the purpose of a reflex or having benefit to having a reflex is it's so fast. Because it's hardwired, because it's a short distance, because it doesn't have to go all the way up into the brain and then come back down, these reflexes happen a whole lot faster, and they're benefit to the organism. And you can see here, this is why the nerve we pull away or pull our hand back even before we really eyes what happens. So the reflex distance, the reflex speed will get the job done faster than the speed going up the spinal column to the brain just by sheer distance going through. So here's another way of looking at that same thing. So this is the patella knee reflex. You hit gently with a hammer. The tendon going over the kneecap is going to pull on this muscle. If you pull on that muscle, its first reaction is to contract to prevent itself from having damage. So we have a sensor there. We go through, we have interneuron in some way, shape, or form. That's going to tell this muscle to relax or not to contract. We have this muscle here, given that we've stretched this muscle out, it's going to want to contract back. And as we contract that, we pull on the tendon here, and that kicks up our leg. So if everything's working in the spinal cord the way it should, that reflex should work without problem. So we're getting down farther into the motor side of things, and we need to talk about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic portions of our involuntary nervous system. Parasympathetic is about winding things down. So if the parasympathetic nerves are dominant, things are going to tend to slow down. Things are going to tend to calm down. We think about with our dairy cows, rest and digest. That relaxed cow chewing her cud in the stall is probably in a parasympathetic state. Sympathetic, we uh, tend to think of things speeding up, things pumping up. So we can think about that as fight, flight, or freeze. In some way, shape, or form, a certain amount of fear is going to lead to one of those reactions. So sympathetic is quick to join the fight. Parasympathetic is about resting and which for involuntary, which is for our cows. Is it the parasympathetic or the sympathetic? Well, our hope is most of our time with our producing dairy cows, we spend in the sympathetic. We can't stay there all the time, or the cow will probably starve to death. She needs a little sympathetic to get going, get up, get moving, take care of the stressors in her life, whatever they may be. But we want her to spend as much time as we can in the sympathetic state as is useful. So if we compare the autonomic nervous system, we have the organ, we have what happens during the sympathetic um, stimulation, what happens during parasympathetic stimulation. Salivary glands, we get a mucus secretion. This is usually called dry mouth versus the serous, the watery secretion in a more relaxed state. Sympathetic's going to inhibit the digestive system. Digestive glands are going to be inhibited. When things are flowing, saliva is flowing in the parasympathetic state, we tend to be more relaxed. Sympathetic, you're going to get that hair follicles contracting, standing up on end. You're not going to stimulate anything with the parasympathetic state. Digestion is going to be inhibited. You're going to have contraction of sphincters. Things are not going to move through as well, and digestion is going to be off. In the relaxed state, we have increased motility. We have increased relaxation of the sphincters, so stuff is flowing through the body. Um, Stuff is being mixed and churned and ruminated and all that stuff. All that stuff helps increase the take from the energy and nutrients from the feed. Um, so we want that to be the dominant state if we can have it. Muscle to bronchi, we're going to open things up during sympathetic state. So we're fight or flight. We need more oxygen. We got to open up the lungs. You've got contraction, so more of a relaxed state as opposed to a ready for fighting state. You can see that we have some problems here with these actions. You're going to soil yourself versus we've got things under control over here. Sympathetic is going to lead to an increased heart rate, parasympathetic decrease, vasoconstriction. You're usually referring to the blood in the skin, but there are other places in the body where we don't waste blood on the skin when we're in a fight or flight situation, the sympathetic response. So we cut the flow rates to non essential organs or not critically essential organs in the short run until the nervous system gets back where it needs to. You got traction of wall, decrease the rate of vasodilation. So we want our heart and lungs to be working easily. We have our lower blood pressure here. This is generally higher blood pressure. We have that nervous system, the afferent side, the efferent side moving through. So we're looking at the efferent side right now. So the voluntary or somatic, you're going to have a central nervous system. The body of the neuron is going to be in the central nervous system, but they have an axon that runs all the way out to the skeletal muscle. So you notice here versus here and here, you have one direct link. And we talked about, in this case, every muscle cell or muscle fiber has its own nerve. So, or at least a communication with one nerve. So this is an example or an illustration of that skeletal muscle. We're dealing with the sympathetic and parasympathetic. We're dealing with the smooth muscle. And you'll notice in this part of the motor side of the nervous system or peripheral nervous system, you have two neurons to get the same signal done. So with sympathetic, you're short and then long, and then you're long then short with the parasympathetic. Different transmitters, depending on the need or depending on what needs to be done. Here's another illustration of the same principle. Again, just one nerve, one direct, coming out of the central nervous system into the peripheral nervous system for each muscle. And then the autonomic is shown there on the bottom. We've got the sympathetic. So you're going to have short and then long, or you're going to stimulate the adrenal cortex, which is going to get things up and running. Parasympathetic, it's long, then short going through. So two nerves to get the signal out of the central nervous system and to its target. So we need twice as many nerve cells for this particular operation. If we think about our animal here, I think it's supposed to be a cow given the udder, but to me it looks like a pig. So again, we're going to focus on the sympathetic is going to have the short and then long. The parasympathetic is going to have the long and then short right next to the target. Another thing to note here is that the parasympathetic comes out of the cervical vertebrae and the sacral vertebrae, versus the sympathetic is going to come out of the thoracic vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae. So that's one way the system tries to keep organized and keep things from cross-contamination. But you can see that we've got lungs, heart, liver, rumen reticulum, large intestine, bladder. I believe this is meant to be okay. Where are we? Kidney. Okay. So we've got all those figured out, the reproductive tract right here. So each of these organs in the body cavity have a nerve set from the sympathetic side and a nerve set from the parasympathetic side. So again, Venn diagrams are a good way to study this. So what are the similarities for the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems? That's going to go right in here. And what are the differences? So the central nervous system, a parasympathetic nervous system will go over here, and the sympathetic will go over here. So be prepared to talk about those next week.